What's up, everybody? My name is Joe Brown, and this is Heresy Financial. The FOMC meeting concluded today. The press conference happened, and basically the message seemed to be get ready for the taper because it's coming. And so we're going to talk about that, talk about why the taper is going to happen. I believe him. I'm not under any. I don't think there are very few situations that I think could happen that would cause the taper to be delayed permanently or not happen or something else to take place. We'll talk about those situations and some things to watch once the taper does start to happen. Ready? Let's dive in. All right, so this first chart that I have up here for you guys, for anybody who's listening on just the audio version, the podcast, we are looking at the federal funds rate. And this is a chart that shows what interest rates have done over the decades. I've got it set from 1980 here as the peak up to the present. And if you can't tell, there's a pretty strong trend line of these peaks in interest rates that kind of hit I don't want to do technical analysis on the federal funds rate, but you can kind of see there's a general trend line that is being hit when interest rates get to a point that the economy can't handle them anymore, and then the Federal Reserve has to reverse course and go back down. So why is this important? Well, Powell mentioned multiple times we're going to taper our asset purchases first, and then we will raise rates. Their asset purchases right now, they are adding assets to their balance sheet, and they print money or create reserves. They pay for those assets, and so there's an exchange, just like when anybody buys anything, right? You give somebody money, they give you something in return. So the Federal Reserve gives money out, and they get treasuries or mortgage-backed securities in return. They are doing that to the tune of at least $120 billion every single month, and so you see ever since really since July of 2020, you've seen a very steady, systematic approach to these asset purchases, these bond purchases, where their balance sheet is just steadily growing every month by somewhere around $120 billion. That is what they're talking about when they're saying they're going to taper. They're going to that rate of increase to their balance sheet will decrease, and it's going to be, by the sounds of it, a significantly quick taper process, where right now they're purchasing at least 120 billion. So they didn't give a specific date, but it sounded like they were hinting towards the end of the year, for let's say November, where they would start to taper. My guess is it's going to be slower at first, and so they'll probably say, okay, maximum of 120 billion a month, and then maybe the next month it goes to 110 billion, and then 100 billion, because they said they want to be done tapering sometime in 2022. Now, that doesn't mean that their balance sheet would be going down at that point. It just means it levels off. And so we see on their balance sheet chart from the years of 2015 through 2018, it was fairly flat. Same thing, their balance sheet was fairly flat relative to now, from 2003 all the way through 2008 before the financial crisis. And so you would see a steadying out of their balance sheet. And so that means that they are no longer injecting new money into the economy in exchange for assets so that money can go do other things. They're no longer injecting new money into the economy through asset purchases. After that is concluded, that is when they can move back over to interest rates. So that's the other kind of side of the coin of monetary policy that the Federal Reserve can engage in, is interest rates, because the lower interest rates are, the more banks have to lend in order to keep their revenues up. Because if you can, if you were making 2% and you were loaning $100 and now you can only loan at 1%, well, now you have to loan $200 to maintain your same revenue. And so lowering interest rates is a tool that central banks have used in order to try and stimulate the economy, to try and force more lending, to force money out into the economy. Now, this is something that has diminishing returns over time. if you can take a look at where I kind of plotted out how this the peaks in interest rates going up have gone down over time, we have a lot less room to go for the next rise in interest rates. Don't pay attention to the dates that you see showing up here; those are incorrect dates. But basically, we might be able to get up to 1% for the federal funds rate on this next course of interest rate hikes. And that might be sometime in 2022 when they start. It would be very gradual. Maybe it hits that peak in 2023, but we won't be able to get much higher than this trend line, simply because it's not a matter of it looks like I'm doing technical analysis or charting on the federal funds rate and on interest rates. That's not what I'm doing here. What I'm showing is the diminishing returns of monetary policy, easy monetary policy, and how economies become addicted to easy money. And once you start to pull that back, it takes less time for the economy to run out of powder and run dry and kind of the brakes to hit. It takes less time for that to grind to a halt. And then the response necessary as a result needs to be more severe. And because it's kind of like, a lot of people use the analogy of a drug addict. You can't, if you go cold turkey, it's going to be very painful. And so what they're doing is just, giving more drugs, giving more morphine, giving more Novocaine, instead of dealing with the actual issue that is at the heart of the health problem in the economy. They're just trying to delay it as long as possible. But when that brings up the question of how long can you kick the can down the road? Well, this is the road. This is really the road here that we're looking at. And so we've got probably one more rate rising period left until that the economy starts to grind to a halt from that, and those rates have to fall in response. There's no more room left after that. We're at zero. You can't move up past that. It's tapped out. That's the end of the road. And so you would see here, you see here a correlation, because where it's not just monetary policy that is taking place here. They've had to, you have to, like I said earlier, you have to increase the amount of stimulus, increase the amount of easing. And one of the ways that shows up is a coordination between monetary policy and fiscal policy. And fiscal policy comes from the government, monetary policy comes from the central bank. So you saw here, this is a chart of the federal surplus or deficit. And this is, goes back since 1910. We saw, in the 40s, big deficit relative to everything that was going on at the time. So we had a big deficit and, came back up. And then in the 80s, deficits again, and then things start to turn back up after that, stimulus was no longer needed. Things came back up. We had a surplus. And recently, since then especially, this is why you see an exponential increase of easy policies, both from monetary and fiscal side. And so you saw it started to come back up through 2005, 2006, 2007 until everything ground to a halt again. This was at the same time when everything when the housing bubble collapsed, they dropped interest rates, so we saw the deficit explode to $1.5 trillion. And then they tried, pulling that back. And now at the same, recently over the last year and a half, the deficits have been double. 2020 was over $3 trillion. And so what will likely happen is we'll likely see this, steady out or move back up a little bit. The deficits will get a little bit better potentially. And then right on schedule. The economy is so reliant on those crutches being maintained and constantly being blown up. It's like a balloon that keeps on getting more and more holes in it. You have to keep on forcing more and more air into it to keep that balloon inflated. But the more air you shove into that balloon, the more it rips those holes wide open, and you have to continually increase the amount of air until it just completely ruptures and there's just no more balloon left. And that is the idea of a government getting so bloated in terms of its, it's such a burden on the economy that it starts to suck more resources out of the economy. And so there's diminishing returns on it being able to deliver any or redistribute resources in a way that produces any growth in any isolated areas. And any growth that you do see in any isolated areas from any redistribution of resources due to this, massive deficit fiscal policy is totally outweighed by the devastation or the losses or the contraction in all of the other areas of the economy. And so, long term from here, it looks like what we're entering into is we've reached a lower bound. We're about to experience another one of these cycles for interest rates where they just start moving up again, because at this point you're for over the last couple of decades, you've got the deflationary forces being pent up and the inflationary policies that are keeping it at bay, and that balancing act between the two gets tighter and tighter and tighter until you're walking a tightrope, and one policy mistake on this side will tip you over into hyperinflation. One policy mistake on this side will tip you over into a deflationary death spiral. So they're walking a tightrope, but they always lean a little bit more towards inflation. And the inflation thing is difficult because once you spill over too far into inflation, monetary policy can cause inflation to start, but it's very difficult to rein that back in because you enter the psychological aspect of a collapse in the faith or the confidence in the currency starts to step in, and people start to dump their money. And the only way to combat that is to increase interest rates. And so that's especially, we saw that obviously during the late 70s when interest rates really started to spike. But since monetary policy, especially in today's political age, tends to lean towards the easy side, tends to lean towards the inflationary side, you're likely to see that inflationary side tip out of control, tip over into maybe not hyperinflation, but high inflation, persistent inflation. And the only way to deal with that is we reach escape velocity from these interest rates, this downward movement in interest rates, and they have no choice but to try and increase interest rates from there in order to pull back and clamp down on that inflation. And we'll see if that's effective or if that works. But that's what I'm looking at right now. But essentially short term, that's a very long term, 5-10 years view that I was just talking about. But short term, we are going to get the taper. The asset purchases are going to start to slow down. And the only way that doesn't happen, in my opinion, is an unforeseen catastrophic global financial system meltdown or event that, causes, the same type of panic that we started to see in March, April, May of 2020. The only one that is foreseeable right now that I can tell that would cause something like that to happen is just a political gridlock that stops the debt ceiling suspension from being pushed out to the end of the year, or debt ceiling just being raised. If for some reason that political gridlock causes a default and the United States starts to default on principal and interest payments on its treasuries, that's a complete game changer, in which case the Federal Reserve's whole playbook for what's going to happen over the next couple of months, couple of years, out the window. That's when they start printing out the wazoo and buying up treasuries from everybody around the world that's selling them, and that's a whole nother story. But ultimately, right now, I don't see anything like that likely at all. It's almost certain that we do start to see the tapering of the asset purchases, get that balance sheet to a place where it's not moving, it's not going up, not going down, and then after that they'll start to look at interest rates, and that's closing in on the end there. That last final move up in interest rates, that's really the end of the road, how far you can kick the can down the road. So as always, really appreciate it. Hopefully that was helpful in looking at what I'm anticipating to happen over the next couple of months as a result of what Powell said today. So as always, thanks so much for watching. Have a great day.